I told my daughter directly that I couldn't watch my grandson and granddaughter that Sunday. My voice was shaking, and my chest felt tight with grief as I explained that I had to attend my brother's funeral. The man who had once saved my life was about to be laid to rest in the cold ground, and I needed to be there to say my final goodbye. I thought she would understand. I expected at least a flicker of basic human sympathy in her eyes. Instead, my daughter, Natalie, just crossed her arms and stared at me with a coldness that made my blood run cold. She said, "You still have to watch them, Dad. There's no other option. We're dropping them off." I stood in my own kitchen, completely stunned, unable to process what I had just heard. If you're just tuning in, take a deep breath. What I'm about to share is a story of calculated betrayal, so deliberate and cold that it forced me to dismantle my own family structure to bring the truth to light. Before I go on, let me know in the comments which city you're watching from today, and if you've ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who tried to take advantage of you. Give this video a like. The air in the kitchen felt heavy and suffocating. I looked at Natalie, searching for any glimpse of the little girl I'd raised, but all I saw was a selfish stranger. My brother Bill was so much more than just a sibling to me. He was the sole reason I was still breathing today. My mind flashed back to a freezing November morning in 1985. We were working on a major high-rise construction site in downtown Chicago. I was a structural engineer, but that morning I was down in the muddy trench inspecting the foundation. Above me, a rusted steel cable suddenly snapped. A massive 2-ton steel beam slipped off the crane, plunging directly toward me. I didn't even hear it falling, but Bill did. Without a second of hesitation, my brother sprinted across the uneven concrete, tackled me out of the trench, and took the devastating force of that falling steel himself. That awful impact severely shattered his legs. He endured 12 painful surgeries and spent the rest of his life walking with a heavy wooden cane. He sacrificed his health to save my life. Every single day he quietly bore that pain without a word of complaint. Also, I could return home safely to hold my baby daughter. And now, decades later, that same girl stood right in front of me, heartlessly denying me the right to lay to rest the very man who had given her a father. I asked her how she could be so heartless. I asked how she could demand this of me during the darkest weekend of my life. That's when her husband, Derek, stepped forward. Derek was a commercial real estate agent. He always wore flashy, expensive custom suits that cost more than my first car. On top of that, he constantly treated me like some ignorant, outdated old man. He looked at me with his usual fake, condescending smile and sighed heavily. He said, "Harrison, please don't make this all about you. My firm is facing a catastrophic financial crisis. We have a make-or-break corporate merger in New York this weekend. If we don't fly out and close this deal, the firm goes under completely. We lose absolutely everything." Natalie jumped right in, her tone dripping with intense malice and emotional manipulation. She stepped in close, aggressively poking her finger into my chest. She asked if I wanted my grandkids to end up out on the street. She accused me of being ultimate in selfishness. She said, "Dad, are you really going to abandon your living grandkids for someone who's already gone? Do you want us to go bankrupt and lose our beautiful home? Bill is gone. He won't even know whether you made it to the funeral or not. But Leo and Mia need you right now." The guilt trip was incredibly heavy and flawlessly calculated. They were gaslighting me, twisting my deep grief into sudden guilt. They knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay. They knew I would walk through fire for my grandkids. Leo was 8, a quiet and intensely observant boy, while little Mia was 6, full of playful life and complete innocence. I looked past Derek and Natalie toward the living room, where the 2 kids were sitting on the carpet, quietly playing with their wooden blocks. They had no idea about the toxic words spilling from their parents' mouths. My chest physically ached with sharp pain. I felt completely backed into a corner. Swallowing my heavy grief, I clenched my rough, calloused hands into fists and slowly nodded. I told them I'd watch the kids. I told them to go to New York and save their company. They didn't even offer a single word of comfort. No thank you. No condolences for the loss of my brother. Derek simply glanced at his expensive gold watch, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and immediately turned toward the door. Natalie walked into the living room, gave Leo and Mia a quick, hollow hug, and told them to behave for Grandpa. Then they headed out the front door, practically jogging down my driveway without looking back once. They got into Derek's brand new luxury sedan and started up the powerful engine. I walked slowly out to the front porch, tightly holding my grandson Leo's little hand. I stood there in absolute silence, watching the sleek car back out of the driveway and accelerate down the quiet suburban street. A profound emptiness settled deep in my chest. I was mourning the heartbreaking loss of my beloved brother, and at the exact same time, I was mourning the daughter I thought I had raised. I felt utterly defeated, weighed down by the selfish demands of my own family. But right then, the quiet morning air was shattered. Little Leo gently tugged on the sleeve of my faded flannel shirt. I looked down at him. He was staring intently down the empty street where his parents' car had just disappeared. He looked up at me with clear, innocent eyes, his small forehead creased in genuine childhood confusion. He asked me a simple question that froze the blood in my veins. He said, "Grandpa, if Mom and Dad are going to a boring office in New York, why did they pack skis and goggles in the trunk?" I froze. My 8-year-old grandson's innocent question hung in the crisp morning air, heavy and sharp, skis and goggles. I looked down at Leo, his big eyes blinking back at me, waiting for an answer I suddenly couldn't provide. My heart began to pound heavily against my ribs. A cold, sinking feeling, the kind of absolute certainty that comes from a lifetime of trusting your instincts, washed over me. I forced a gentle smile for the little boy, telling him that sometimes adults bring silly things on stressful trips just to help themselves feel better. It was a flimsy excuse, but it satisfied him enough to run back inside and play with his sister. I stood motionless on the wooden porch for a long time. The stillness of the neighborhood felt heavy and oppressive. I had to know the absolute truth. Walking back inside, I made sure the kids were happily playing with their blocks in the living room. Then I slipped into the kitchen and picked up Leo's digital tablet from the granite countertop. A few years back, my daughter had installed a family tracking app on it, claiming it made it easy to keep tabs on everyone. She used to brag to her friends about how it kept our family safe and connected. With trembling fingers, I opened the app. The bright screen loaded a digital map showing small icons for each of our devices. I zoomed in on the icon representing Derek's phone. If they were truly flying to New York for a make-or-break merger, they'd be heading straight for the busy terminals of the major international airport. But the small blue dot on the screen wasn't moving that way at all. It was traveling in the exact opposite direction. I watched as the digital dot glided smoothly along the highway, turning off the main road and heading straight toward an exclusive private airport on the edge of the city's wealthy district. I tapped on the detailed destination forecast provided by the app based on their flight bookings and linked calendar. The screen cheerfully informed me that they had booked a private charter flight. Their destination was a luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. That blue digital dot blinked rhythmically, as if mocking my profound grief. Aspen. They went to Aspen. A wave of sickening nausea rolled through my stomach, knotting my insides into a painful twist. They hadn't just lied to me. They had looked me straight in the eyes, invoked the memory of my late brother, and shamefully manipulated me, all so they could sip expensive champagne on a snowy mountain. They ditched the funeral of the brave man who had saved my life for a luxury vacation. The sheer heartlessness of it knocked the breath right out of my lungs. They weaponized my deepest grief against me. They took my love for my grandkids and turned it into convenient, free childcare. A burning rage ignited deep within my chest, a quiet, dangerous resolve I hadn't felt in decades. It was the kind of cold focus that steadies your hands and sharpens your mind to absolute clarity. For the rest of the day, I went through the motions of being a loving grandfather. I made them their favorite macaroni and cheese for lunch, built tall block towers, and read them adventure stories until their little eyes grew heavy. When the sun finally set and the house fell completely silent, I knew exactly what I had to do. The boundaries of trust had been completely shattered. It was time to pull back the curtain. I walked slowly down the long hallway and stood before the heavy oak door of Derek's home office. He had always strictly forbidden anyone from stepping inside. I turned the cold brass knob. It was unlocked. I pushed the heavy door open, stepped inside, and switched on a small, elegant desk lamp. The room was practically a shrine to superficial wealth and fragile ego. Everything about the space was designed to project an image of unearned success. There were imported leather couches, a massive mahogany desk polished to a mirror's shine, and meaningless yet astronomically expensive abstract paintings. I stood there in the warm, dim light, looking down at my own hands. They were rough, permanently scarred, and heavily calloused from 40 years of welding structural steel and drafting architectural blueprints. I built real things. I built structures designed to withstand howling hurricanes and violent earthquakes. I worked until my back ached and my fingers bled, all to give my daughter a solid, unshakable foundation. And yet she chose a man who built nothing, someone who traded in invisible money and lived behind a hollow facade. A deep sense of failure as a father washed over me. Somewhere along the way, I had raised a daughter who valued this empty, flashy room more than basic human decency. I began searching the room, no longer caring about boundaries or privacy. I sat in his plush leather chair and inspected the massive mahogany desk. Down in the bottom right corner was a heavy steel drawer. I pulled the handle, but it was locked tight, a small keyhole flush with the dark wood. But I was an engineer. Spending decades on rugged construction sites teaches you how things are put together, which also means you know how to bypass them. I retrieved a metal tension wrench and a flat pick from my toolkit. Kneeling beside the desk, I slid the tools into the keyhole and applied subtle pressure. A sharp click echoed through the quiet room. The lock gave way. I pulled the drawer open. Inside sat a thick folder. Printed on the front label was my full name, followed immediately by my home address. My heart pounded against my ribs as I reached into the dark metal drawer and pulled out the heavy manila folder. The stiff paper felt cold and rigid against my calloused fingertips. My legal name, Harrison Cole, was printed clearly in bold black ink on the top label, right above the address of the home I'd lived in for over 40 years. Leaning back into Derek's plush leather chair, I carefully set the folder down on the polished mahogany surface. The quiet, steady hum of the central AC suddenly sounded as loud as a rushing wind. I slowly opened the cover. The very first document was a comprehensive property appraisal report. Printed on heavy, expensive paper, it featured high-resolution color photos of my own front yard. I stared at the glossy image of my house. It was a beautiful 1920s craftsman-style home, sitting on a quiet, tree-lined street in the historic center of Chicago. I hadn't just bought that house. I had poured my literal sweat and effort into it. When my late wife and I first bought the property, it was nothing more than a decaying, forgotten shell. Over 30 years, I restored every single inch of it by hand. I mixed heavy concrete myself to rebuild the crumbling stone foundation. I climbed onto the steep roof in the scorching summer heat, laying down every cedar shingle with my own hands. I spent late nights in the garage, meticulously sanding the original oak floors until they gleamed. That house wasn't just real estate. It was a living monument to my marriage and a safe haven I built for my family. Seeing it reduced to a stack of cold appraisal photos inside Derek's drawer made my stomach turn. I turned the pages, scanning through dense financial text. The appraiser had carefully detailed the custom woodwork and reinforced steel beams I installed to open up the living room, valuing my life's work at $1.8 million. A chilling question echoed through my mind. Why would Derek, a commercial real estate agent specializing in high-rise office buildings, secretly commission a residential appraisal of my private home? I had completely paid off the mortgage 15 years ago, shortly after my beloved wife passed away. I did that specifically to ensure I wouldn't owe any bank a single penny for the rest of my life. I wanted to leave my daughter a completely unburdened, debt-free legacy. I flipped to the final page of the appraisal report, desperately hoping to find a logical explanation. What I found made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Attached behind the photos was a thick stack of official, legally binding bank documents stamped with a prominent national bank's watermark. Right at the top of the first page, bold capital letters spelled out, Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. My breathing grew short and fast. A home equity line of credit, or HELOC, is a tool that allows a homeowner to borrow money using the built-up value of their home as collateral. It's essentially a secondary mortgage. I pulled a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from my shirt pocket, my rough hands trembling violently. Putting them on, I forced my aging eyes to focus on the fine print. The document outlined a massive financial agreement. Someone had successfully applied for and secured a massive loan against the value of my completely paid-off craftsman home. I scanned down to the middle of the page where the principal loan amount was printed in bold, undeniable ink, $600,000. The numbers blurred before my eyes as a sudden rush of severe dizziness hit me. $600,000. It was an astronomical figure. If this loan went into default, the bank possessed the absolute legal right to foreclose on my property. They could seize the house I had rebuilt with my own hands, legally evict me, and sell it off to the highest bidder at an auction. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. A layer of cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This had to be a mistake. A bank couldn't just hand over more than $500,000 and place a massive lien on a property without explicit, legally binding authorization from the owner. I had never spoken to a loan officer. I had never set foot inside that specific bank branch in my entire life. And I certainly never agreed to risk losing my home to fund any hidden, luxurious getaway for Derek and Natalie. Gripping the edges of the paper, my knuckles turned stark white under the pressure. I flipped quickly through the dense pages of legal jargon, skipping past complex interest rates and strict repayment schedules. I went straight for the very last page, the primary signature page. I looked down at the bottom right corner of the document, where the main borrower was legally required to sign. The breath caught completely in my throat. There, resting perfectly on the solid black line, was my name, Harrison Cole. I leaned in closer, my eyes filled with terror and total disbelief. It was a flawless forgery of my own handwriting. The distinct, graceful arcs of my cursive and the deliberate angle of my signature were replicated with chilling precision. I ran my thumb over the ink, feeling the faint indents where the pen had pressed into the paper, and right beside that perfectly forged signature, giving this fraudulent agreement official power and full legal weight, was the raised, dark blue ink seal of an official state notary, public. I stared at the signature on that final page, my mind completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of this crime. This wasn't just a sloppy attempt at copying my name. It was a calculated, legally binding authorization, officially validated by a notary's stamp. Running my shaking fingers over the blue ink, a deep, sickening feeling spread through my chest. How could a major national bank approve a $600,000 loan without ever speaking to me directly? How could a professional notary legally witness a signature I never provided? These unsettling questions raced through my head like a storm. Leaning back into the plush leather chair, I rubbed my aching temples as a cold reality began to surface. I closed my weary eyes, and suddenly, a buried memory cut through my confusion. The answer wasn't simple forgery in the traditional sense. The answer was a dangerous weapon, and it was a weapon I had willingly handed to my own daughter. 5 years ago, I suffered a sudden health scare. I was working alone in my detached garage, carefully sanding a slab of reclaimed oak for a new dining table, when a sharp pain hit my chest. The world spun completely out of focus. It turned out to be just a minor blood pressure issue, easily manageable with basic prescription medication and a few lifestyle changes. But out of extreme caution, my doctor required me to stay overnight at the local hospital for observation. The sterile room felt cold and lonely, constantly reminding me of the tragic night I lost my beloved wife. As soon as Natalie heard the news, she rushed to my bedside. Looking back now, I realize she played the role of a terrified, devoted daughter to perfection. She sat beside my bed for hours, her eyes swollen from crying, tightly clutching my rough, calloused hands in her soft ones. Over and over, she told me how terrified she was of losing her only surviving parent. She begged me to be responsible and plan practically for an uncertain future. Tears streaming down her face, she produced a thick, professionally bound, legal document. She called it a standard medical and financial power of attorney. Swearing on her late mother's memory, she claimed it was just a necessary precaution, a harmless safety net in case I ever became incapacitated and unable to make vital decisions for myself. I was physically weak, heavily medicated, and overwhelmed by a father's unconditional love for a deeply anxious child. I trusted her with my life. Without a single second of hesitation, I signed the legal document, willingly granting her absolute authority to act on my behalf in any financial or medical matter. Opening my eyes in Derek's quiet, dimly lit office, the painful memory made my stomach turn. That signed paper was never meant to be a loving safety net. It was a blank check. It was a loaded weapon she kept tucked away in her back pocket for 5 long years, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. Using that comprehensive power of attorney, she bypassed my direct consent completely legally. With that notarized document, she could walk into any commercial bank, sit down opposite a senior loan officer, and legally sign my name, saddling me with a massive financial burden without me ever needing to be present. The official notary seal on that fraudulent loan agreement wasn't verifying that I was sitting in the room. It was officially verifying that my legally designated representative, my own flesh and blood, was authorized to completely dismantle my life savings. She had callously weaponized my aging and my deep love for her, turning them directly against me. The sheer weight of this ultimate betrayal felt completely suffocating. I needed to see the full extent of this financial damage with my own eyes. I had to know exactly how deep this wound went. Reaching into the pocket of my faded jeans, I pulled out my smartphone. I'm a simple man who lives a very routine, old-fashioned life. I lived comfortably on my hard-earned pension and the modest savings I had gradually accumulated over a long career of manual labor. Because of that, I rarely checked my online banking portal. My monthly expenses were very low. I didn't buy flashy things, and I certainly never gambled with my financial security. My calloused hands were shaking so severely in the quiet room that it took me 3 frustrating attempts just to type in my passcode. As the banking app slowly loaded, the small screen illuminated my tired, lined face. I navigated to the main dashboard, bracing my fragile heart for whatever reality awaited me. My standard checking account balance appeared at the top of the screen, looking completely untouched. But right below it, a brand new account category had been created under my name. It was clearly labeled Home Equity Line of Credit. The remaining available balance for this massive loan read $0. My heart dropped. A $600,000 loan had been fully approved and completely drained. I quickly tapped on the recent transaction history for that specific account. The stolen money hadn't stayed in my hands for even a minute. Just 3 days prior, a massive outgoing wire transfer had been initiated. It was sent directly to a mysterious corporate entity named Apex Holdings, LLC. I stared at those 3 words glowing on the screen. Apex Holdings, LLC. The name meant nothing to me, but the heavy reality settled deep into my bones. My hard-earned $600,000 legacy had vanished into thin air at 2 a.m. Slowly closing the banking app, I looked up at the expensive walls of Derek's office. The grief over my brother's passing still weighed on me like an anchor, but a much stronger force was rapidly taking over. It was pure determination. I was not going to be a silent victim. I was a structural engineer. When a building shows signs of catastrophic failure, you don't sit back and cry. You bring in heavy machinery, and you dig out the rot. Reaching for my phone, I scrolled past my daughter's name and stopped at Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan wasn't just any attorney. He was a relentless corporate litigator, a legal force known for taking down corrupt executives in federal court. More importantly, he owed me a massive favor. Back in the 90s, Jonathan's father owned a commercial high-rise that was sinking due to severe foundation failure. Other firms told him to tear the building down. I spent 3 months in the mud, designing a custom steel underpinning system that saved his father from total bankruptcy. Jonathan had sworn back then that if I ever needed anything, all I had to do was call. I hit the dial button. The digital clock read exactly 2 a.m. The phone rang 3 times before the line connected. A sleep-deprived voice demanded to know who was calling at such an ungodly hour. I didn't apologize. I simply spoke his name and told him it was Harrison Cole. The irritation on the other end vanished instantly. I heard the rustle of blankets and the sharp click of a bedside lamp turning on. He asked me what was wrong. Taking a deep breath, I laid out the entire nightmare. I told him about the missed funeral, the fake merger, the trip to Aspen, the fraudulent appraisal, and the forged HELOC. Finally, I gave him the name of the entity holding my savings. Jonathan didn't offer empty sympathy. He took immediate action. I heard him walking down a hallway, a door opening, followed by the rapid clatter of a mechanical keyboard. He told me to stay on the line. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound was the fierce typing of a master litigator slicing through layers of corporate obscurity. Jonathan had access to high-level financial databases and private federal court registries that the general public could never see. He began pulling on the digital threads of Apex Holdings LLC. His voice broke the silence, cold and purely analytical. He told me that Apex was a shell company, an anonymous entity registered in Delaware just 3 weeks prior. The registered agent was a post office box, and the officers were hidden behind privacy shields. But Jonathan was an absolute expert in these matters. Bypassing the state registry, he dug deep into the corresponding tax, ID, and bank routing codes. He cross-referenced those numbers with Illinois commercial real estate licenses. A heavy sigh echoed through the phone speaker. He found a direct link. The shell company had been secretly set up by an affiliated law firm representing Derek directly. I asked Jonathan why Derek would go through such illegal lengths to steal the equity from my home. If his brokerage was simply struggling in a tough market, they had legal avenues to declare bankruptcy. The typing on Jonathan's end grew even faster. He told me he was pulling up the civil litigation records for Derek's primary firm. Suddenly, Jonathan let out a low whistle. The truth wasn't just a failing business. It was a massive, sprawling criminal empire. Jonathan read the confidential legal documents aloud to me in the dark. Derek wasn't just losing money. He was being sued by 3 separate groups of powerful private investors for catastrophic embezzlement. Over the past 4 years, Derek had been running a complex financial shell game, a classic Ponzi scheme. He was taking millions from new investors to pay off the old ones, all while quietly siphoning off a massive percentage to fund his own lavish lifestyle. Those custom Italian suits, the brand new luxury cars, the exclusive ski trips to Colorado, none of it was earned. It was all stolen money, and now the entire house of cards was collapsing right on top of him. The investors had filed emergency injunctions. If Derek didn't come up with a massive cash settlement by the end of the month to satisfy them, they were handing a mountain of evidence over to federal authorities. That $600,000 stolen from my home wasn't an investment. It was pure blood money, a desperate, panicked attempt to pay off legal settlements and keep Derek out of a federal prison jumpsuit. My own daughter had willingly sacrificed my absolute financial security just to keep her criminal husband from behind bars. A sickening wave of betrayal washed over me. I was just about to ask Jonathan how we could freeze the stolen funds, contact the bank's fraud department, and shut down this nightmare once and for all. But suddenly, the rapid, aggressive typing on the other end of the line stopped completely. The silence on the line was profound and deeply unsettling. It stretched on for 10 agonizing seconds. When Jonathan finally spoke again, his tone was entirely different. The confident, analytical voice of the corporate powerhouse was gone, replaced by a quiet, terrible hesitation. He took a slow, shaky breath and said, "Harrison, I need you to brace yourself right now. They didn't just steal the money to pay Derek's debts. Check your personal email inbox immediately. I just forwarded you the official family court docket for next Monday." My hands went completely numb as I minimized the bank window and opened my personal email app. In the quiet, dark room, the bright screen felt like a harsh spotlight. Right at the top of my inbox was a secure, encrypted message from Jonathan Pierce. It contained a heavy PDF attachment titled "Emergency Petition for Full Conservatorship." With trembling fingers, I tapped the document and watched it load, feeling a suffocating pressure building deep in my chest. The first page bore the official seal of the state family court system in bold black ink. I read the formal legal header at the top. Petitioner, Natalie Cole. Respondent, Harrison Cole. My own flesh and blood, the child I had protected and provided for my entire life, was officially suing me for complete legal control over my physical autonomy and financial independence. I read through the opening paragraphs, every calculated, emotionless legal phrase making my stomach churn violently. She was formally petitioning a federal judge to declare me completely mentally incapacitated and unfit to manage my own basic affairs. Suddenly, the past 6 months of my life flashed before my eyes, shifting from innocent memories into a calculated nightmare. Starting earlier that year, Natalie had become unnaturally focused and involved in my personal health. She insisted over and over that the doctor I had trusted for 20 years was completely outdated. She kept pushing me to see a highly specialized, expensive private doctor she claimed to have found on the other side of the city. She aggressively offered to drive me to every single one of those appointments. Sitting right beside me in the sterile examination room, she would carefully answer all the doctor's medical questions before I even had a chance to speak. She would place a fake, comforting hand on my shoulder, telling the man in the white coat that I was constantly forgetting simple things, that I was misplacing my house keys every day. She claimed I would get hopelessly lost, taking routine walks through my own neighborhood. At the time, I foolishly thought she was just an overprotective daughter, acting out of natural anxiety for her aging father. I would playfully roll my eyes, assure the stern doctor I was completely fine, and brush off her exaggerated stories as normal family concern. But sitting alone in Derek's office, the chilling truth hit me with the brutal force of a runaway freight train. She was never protecting me. She was methodically building a false paper trail of evidence to systematically dismantle me. She was patiently laying a complex foundation to permanently steal my absolute freedom. I kept scrolling down the screen, reviewing the supporting medical evidence strategically attached to the legal petition. There were 3 formal assessment letters signed by that exact same shady private doctor. The clinical notes were a complete, malicious fabrication of my actual mental state. The doctor explicitly stated in bold print that I suffered from severe, rapidly deteriorating dementia. He falsely claimed I experienced frequent, terrifying paranoid delusions on a weekly basis. He even wrote, with absolute medical authority, that I had recently begun displaying sudden, uncontrollable violent outbursts, posing a severe physical danger to myself and the family around me. I was reading a chilling description of a dangerous stranger, a violent madman who belonged safely locked away in a hospital ward, not the gentle structural engineer who spent quiet weekends carefully building wooden birdhouses with his beloved grandkids. The legal petition clearly outlined her ultimate devastating demand. If the presiding judge granted the emergency motion on Monday morning, Natalie would instantly gain absolute, irrevocable control over every single aspect of the rest of my life. She would have unrestricted legal power to liquidate my secure bank accounts, sell my historic craftsman home right out from under me to pay off Derek's massive criminal debts, and forcefully commit me to a restricted psychiatric care facility completely against my will. In a single instant, I would permanently lose my home, my hard-earned life legacy, and my basic human dignity. I would become a helpless prisoner, entirely controlled by my own flesh and blood. Rereading the damning document, my engineer's mind fought desperately against the rising tide of emotional panic. My entire adult life had been spent carefully analyzing structural systems, constantly searching for hidden vulnerabilities in massive designs. The federal legal system was just another structure. It relied heavily on solid foundational evidence to support its massive claims. I stared hard at those fraudulent medical evaluations. Yes, they were deeply damaging, but they were still just printed words on a page from a single private doctor. The strict legal standard for an emergency, immediate conservatorship that completely bypassed a standard jury trial required something far more substantial. A judge wouldn't strip an adult, functioning man of his constitutional rights based solely on exaggerated medical notes and the worried testimony of a greedy daughter. The court would demand undeniable, concrete proof that I posed an imminent physical danger to society. They needed a catalyst. They needed a recent, highly documented event that conclusively proved the kind of violent instability the corrupt doctor claimed. The petition heavily cited a volatile and dangerous psychological state, but it was clearly missing that final piece of overwhelming evidence needed to get a judge's signature. I slowly lowered the digital tablet, staring blindly into the dark shadows of the room. Why would they go on a luxury vacation just 2 days before launching a legal strike of this magnitude? Why would they intentionally provoke me, heartlessly forcing me to miss my heroic brother's sacred funeral? The blood in my veins turned utterly cold. They needed me to break. They needed me to explode. To secure that emergency conservatorship, they required direct, undeniable proof of my violent instability. Pushing the digital tablet away, the horrifying implications behind their timeline raced through my mind. If they needed a documented incident to prove my supposed violent instability to a federal judge on Monday morning, then this entire weekend wasn't just a convenient vacation for them. It was a carefully constructed psychological trap. I needed to know exactly how they planned to trigger it. Turning my attention away from the heavy mahogany desk, I looked at the sleek silver laptop sitting quietly on a side table. Derek was notoriously arrogant about his intelligence. He frequently mocked security protocols, often leaving his devices in sleep mode rather than completely shutting them down. I walked over and tapped the trackpad gently. The screen lit up instantly, bypassing the login screen entirely since the device was still connected to his home network. Minimizing his cluttered email inbox, I scanned the open applications running in the background. My eyes locked onto a small gray icon shaped like a microphone. It was a professional-grade audio recording software typically used to archive long meetings. The program was open, displaying a timeline of recent files. The latest file had been created just 2 days prior, titled simply Legal Strategy Meeting. Plugging a pair of expensive noise-canceling headphones into the side of the laptop, I carefully placed them over my ears and hit play. A sharp hiss of static filled my ears, followed by my son-in-law's familiar, arrogant voice clearing his throat. Derek was talking to a man with a deep, authoritative voice. I quickly inferred from their formal tone that this was the aggressive family court attorney they had hired to orchestrate my legal destruction. The attorney sounded impatient. He explicitly warned Derek and Natalie that fake medical documents and a private doctor's testimony would only get them through the courtroom door. He pointed out clearly that judges are naturally skeptical of sudden conservatorship requests, especially when a massive financial legacy is involved. The lawyer told them that unless they could provide irrefutable, undeniable proof of imminent danger, the judge might order a lengthy independent medical evaluation, which would completely stall their timeline and expose the fraudulent bank loan. Then I heard my daughter's voice. It was the same sweet voice she'd had 30 years ago, but now it dripped with chilling, calculated malice. She told the lawyer not to worry about an independent evaluation. She assured him they would deliver the perfect, damning evidence by Sunday night. I gripped the edge of the table so tightly, my knuckles turned completely pale. Listening to my own child outline her trap, Natalie explained her strategy with the cold precision of a military general planning an ambush. She said, My uncle's funeral is this Sunday. My dad has been mourning his brother all week. He's physically exhausted, completely heartbroken, and highly emotional right now. We're going to pack our bags and tell him we have a sudden, make-or-break business trip. We're dropping the kids on him at the last minute and forcing him to miss the funeral service entirely. He is going to be absolutely furious. He'll be severely sleep-deprived, overwhelmed with grief, and completely buried under the stress of taking care of two energetic kids alone. We are going to push him to his absolute breaking point. The lawyer asked how missing a funeral proved severe dementia and violent tendencies. Derek's voice cut in, filled with cruel amusement. Derek explained that they knew exactly how to trigger my deepest frustration. They knew I was a man of immense pride and a rigid sense of structure. By trapping me in my own house while I was mourning the most important person in my life, they were creating a pressure cooker of raw emotional pain. They were actively counting on my immense grief, manifesting as an uncontrollable, explosive outburst. Natalie confidently told the lawyer that I would eventually snap. She said he would throw a temper tantrum, scream at the kids, and maybe even throw things against the wall out of pure frustration. And when he did, they would have perfect high-definition proof of his violent instability. The judge would have no choice but to grant the emergency conservatorship order immediately. The breath caught violently in my throat. Proof? How could they possibly capture high-definition proof inside my house when they were thousands of miles away? The lawyer asked them that exact same question. Natalie let out a soft, dark laugh that turned my stomach. She said, Derek spent the entire week prepping the house. We have total coverage. Hidden cameras will capture every single second of his breakdown. The recording kept playing, but I couldn't hear the treacherous words anymore. A deafening ringing filled my ears. Hidden cameras. My own daughter and her criminal husband had secretly wired my house to record my lowest, most vulnerable moment. They had turned my safe haven into a digital prison designed to destroy my life. Slowly taking the heavy headphones off my ears, I let them drop onto the desk. The quiet home office suddenly felt impossibly small and sinister. Every shadow seemed to hold a dark secret. Every corner felt like a physical threat. Standing tall, I controlled my rapid breathing with the strict discipline of a seasoned engineer. I slowly raised my head, scanning the expensive artwork on the walls. My eyes drifted toward the ceiling, tracing the path of the electrical wiring. I paused. Directly above Derek's heavy mahogany desk was a standard round smoke detector. I stared hard at that small plastic grill. Deep inside the dark plastic vent, a tiny, unblinking red light stared straight back at me. My first instinct was violent. I wanted to grab the heavy brass lamp sitting on the corner of the mahogany desk and smash that plastic smoke detector into 1,000 jagged pieces. I wanted to scream into the hidden microphone, letting them know I had discovered their disgusting, treacherous trap. But I didn't move a single muscle. The structural engineer in my mind took over immediately, suppressing the raw, burning rage of a betrayed father. When you discover a massive structural flaw in a building, you don't just take a sledgehammer to the load-bearing walls. If you strike out blindly, the entire roof collapses right on top of you, burying you in the rubble of your own impulsive anger. You have to step back, analyze the complex framework, find the central pillars supporting the toxic structure, and remove it with absolute, silent precision. I slowly lowered my eyes from the ceiling, acting as if I were simply stretching my tired neck. Calmly shutting down the silver laptop, I wiped my fingerprints off the smooth trackpad, slipped quietly out of the dark home office, and gently closed the heavy oak door behind me. Returning to the guest room, I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling until the sun began to rise. I wasn't going to give them the explosive, violent reaction they so desperately needed. I was going to give them the exact opposite. When Sunday morning arrived, the very day of my beloved brother's funeral, I didn't shed a single visible tear. I buried my deep grief into the absolute lowest depths of my soul, locking it behind a heavy door forged from pure determination. Walking into the kitchen, I put a bright, cheerful smile on my face. Opening the massive stainless steel refrigerator, I pulled out eggs, milk, and fresh blueberries. I started mixing pancake batter from scratch, humming a happy, upbeat tune loud enough for the hidden microphones to catch clearly. When little Leo and Mia woke up, rubbing their sleepy eyes as they walked into the kitchen, I greeted them with genuine, joyful laughter. I lifted Mia into the air, spinning her around and listening to her sweet giggles fill the room. I let Leo help me flip golden pancakes on the hot griddle, patiently guiding his small hands. Throughout the entire morning breakfast, I maintained the absolute image of a loving, patient, and completely stable grandfather. I told them funny stories from my childhood, asked engaging questions about their favorite school subjects, and made sure my voice remained calm, steady, and utterly free of frustration. But as I served warm maple syrup with a smile, my sharp, analytical eyes were actively scanning every inch of the open concept living space. I was systematically mapping out the digital perimeter. I found the second hidden camera cleverly tucked into the hollowed-out spine of a decorative book on the living room shelf. I located the third one, perfectly concealed behind the dark glass of a digital smart clock on the kitchen counter. Drawing on decades of experience in spatial geometry and architectural drafting, I calculated the precise viewing angles and focal lengths of every tiny lens in my head. Identifying the overlapping fields of view, I pinpointed the exact narrow blind spots where their digital eyes couldn't reach. I knew precisely where I could stand in the hallway to be completely invisible. I calculated the exact angle in the dining room that blocked the kitchen camera from filming my hand movements. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a digital cage. I was an architect navigating his own carefully designed floor plan. By 10 a.m., the kids had finished their hearty breakfast and were happily settled on the plush living room couch. Turning on the massive flat-screen television, I found their absolute favorite animated movie. I made sure they had soft blankets and a large bowl of fresh fruit snacks. Standing in the exact center of the living room, I looked straight into the camera hidden in the bookshelf. I smiled warmly and announced in a clear, cheerful voice that I was going to wash a load of laundry for them, so their parents wouldn't have to worry about chores when they returned from their stressful trip. Picking up a plastic laundry basket, I casually strolled out of the camera's wide line of sight. The moment I crossed the invisible threshold into a blind spot, my cheerful smile vanished, replaced by cold, rock-solid determination. I didn't go to the laundry room. I had a far more important technical task to complete. I knew that professional-grade, high-definition security cameras recording continuous video and audio require massive digital storage. They couldn't rely solely on basic wireless connections uploading to an external cloud, especially given the heavy-duty firewall Derek proudly maintained for his business files. They had to be hardwired to a central physical hub hidden somewhere in the house. I quietly opened the basement door and tiptoed down the wooden stairs, my rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the steps. The basement was a vast, unfinished concrete space, mainly used for storing old holiday decorations and heavy fitness equipment. Walking past dusty cardboard boxes, I traced a bundle of insulated black cables, rooted securely along the wooden ceiling joists. Those thick lines led directly into a locked, well-ventilated metal utility closet hidden in the farthest, darkest corner of the cold basement. Pulling the metal tension wrench from my pocket, I quickly bypassed the simple lock on the utility door. Inside, sitting on a shelf, was a server box. I plugged my encrypted external drive into it. Staring at the flashing green lights on the heavy server box, I watched the digital progress bar on the small monitoring screen slowly fill. My encrypted drive hummed quietly in the damp basement air as it systematically copied every single byte of their surveillance footage. Opening the file directory, I clicked on the most recent video clip. The screen lit up with a high-definition, wide-angle view of the living room above. I watched myself walk across the floor, smiling, holding the plastic laundry basket, completely oblivious in their eyes, yet entirely in control in my own. I had absolute proof of their calculated trap. They had meticulously recorded my every move, intending to capture a manufactured breakdown, but instead they had documented my complete sanity alongside their own malicious scheme. Once the transfer finished, I safely ejected the drive and tucked it deep into my front pocket. Carefully closing the metal utility door to ensure it looked untouched, I walked back upstairs to check on my grandkids. They were still completely absorbed in the animated movie. Stepping out onto the secluded backyard patio, I pulled the glass sliding door shut to block out any sound. The crisp afternoon air filled my lungs. Pulling out my phone, I called Jonathan Pierce for the second time that weekend. He picked up on the very first ring, his voice sharp and fully alert despite it being Sunday afternoon. I quickly briefed him on the hidden cameras and the audio recording I had extracted from Derek's laptop regarding their master plan. I told him they were intentionally trying to provoke a violent reaction to secure an emergency conservatorship on Monday morning. Jonathan went quiet for a moment, processing the sheer cruelty of my daughter's strategy. He sighed heavily, telling me we needed to file an immediate counter-injunction to block the conservatorship application. But he expressed concern about the massive $600,000 loan they had secured against my home. He explained that untangling a legally binding financial contract of that scale could take years of grueling, expensive litigation in civil court. Standing on the wooden deck, looking out at the manicured lawn, a faint, cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. I told Jonathan we wouldn't be wasting time fighting in civil court. I told him it was finally time to execute Plan B. Sounding genuinely confused, he asked what I meant. I reminded him that exactly 2 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I had paid an unexpected visit to his downtown law firm. 2 years ago, during Thanksgiving week, I had returned home early from a routine grocery run. Walking into my bedroom, I had found Natalie kneeling on the floor of my walk-in closet. She was holding a set of lockpicks, desperately trying to force open the heavy steel safe, containing my most sensitive personal documents and family heirlooms. When I confronted her, she instantly burst into dramatic tears, claiming she was just looking for an old recipe card belonging to her late mother and had misremembered where it was stored. To avoid ruining the holiday, I accepted her flimsy excuse at the time, but my deep-seated instincts were screaming at me. A daughter doesn't secretly try to pick a steel lock for a recipe card. That very same afternoon, while she was still busy baking pies in the kitchen, I drove straight to Jonathan's office. Sitting in his leather chair, I instructed him to immediately and permanently revoke the comprehensive power of attorney I had naively signed for her at the hospital 3 years prior. We drafted a brand new, ironclad legal document that completely stripped Natalie of any and all authority over my medical or financial decisions. We formally filed the revocation with the state registry, rendering the original document absolute dead letter in the eyes of the law. I simply never told her I did it. I let her continue believing she held the ultimate key to my life, waiting to see if she would ever be greedy enough to actually use it against me. Standing alone on the quiet patio, listening to the gentle breeze rustle the leaves of the tall oak trees, I explained to Jonathan that the original power of attorney document Natalie had proudly presented to the bank the previous week was legally worthless. It was nothing more than a piece of scrap paper that had been officially canceled 24 months ago. I heard a sudden, sharp intake of breath over the line. Jonathan's brilliant legal mind quickly processed the massive implications of what I had just revealed. The silence lasted for several seconds before a low, dark laugh came through the speaker. He said, "Harrison, if that power of attorney was legally void 2 years ago, then she had zero authority to sign your name on those bank documents." He paused, the heavy weight of impending justice settling firmly into his voice. The $600,000 loan she took out last week isn't just a standard elder abuse case or civil theft. By intentionally presenting a revoked legal document to a federally insured financial institution to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars, she crossed a massive legal line. That is federal bank fraud, and the penalty for defrauding a national bank out of over $500,000 is a mandatory federal prison sentence she can never escape. The reality of Jonathan's words hung heavily in the crisp afternoon air, Federal bank fraud, mandatory prison time. I stood on the deck, the phone pressed to my ear, processing the absolute ruin heading straight for my family. I had spent my entire career building structures designed to withstand catastrophic failures, but no blueprint exists to teach you how to survive the collapse of your own flesh and blood. I thanked Jonathan for his legal mind and told him to prepare the necessary filings for the authorities. I hung up the phone. My thoughts turned immediately to the two innocent souls sitting in the living room, Leo and Mia. If Natalie and Derek were facing severe federal prosecution, the children would instantly become collateral damage. They would be thrust into a chaotic state foster system, traumatized forever. I needed to build a secure foundation for them, completely isolated from their parents' corruption. I thought of Derek's parents, Richard and Martha. They were decent, hard-working people at their core. Richard was a retired history teacher, and Martha had served as a pediatric nurse for 30 years. They lived modestly, completely blinded by the flashy, superficial success their son constantly paraded in front of them. They truly believed Derek was a brilliant, honest businessman. I knew the truth would shatter their hearts, but I also knew they loved their grandchildren deeply. Pulling out my phone, I dialed Richard's number. When he answered, his voice was warm, completely unaware of the nightmare brewing. I skipped the pleasantries entirely. Lowering my voice, I told him a severe, life-altering emergency involving Leo and Mia had come up. I instructed him to bring Martha and drive to the house immediately. I specifically warned them to park a block away, walk quietly down the back alley, and enter only through the backyard sliding glass door. Richard didn't ask unnecessary questions. The sheer urgency in my voice said everything. Less than 40 minutes later, I saw them hurrying across the lawn, their faces pale with intense worry. Pulling open the glass door, I ushered them inside, pressing a finger to my lips to demand absolute silence. I carefully guided them through the digital blind spots I had mapped out earlier, bringing them to a secluded corner of the formal dining room, well out of reach of any hidden camera. The kids were still absorbed in their movie in the adjacent room, completely unaware of the silent gathering. Martha gripped my arm, her eyes filled with terror, silently pleading for an explanation. I didn't try to soften the blow. Pulling the photocopied financial documents from my jacket, I spread them out across the mahogany table. I showed them every terrible detail: the forged appraisal of my historic craftsman home, the fraudulent HELOC agreement, pointing directly to the expertly forged signature at the bottom of the page. Then I produced the civil litigation documents Jonathan had sent me. I watched the blood drain entirely from Richard's face as he read the formal, legal charges of massive corporate embezzlement against his only son. Reading the staggering figures, he realized Derek's lavish lifestyle was funded entirely by millions of dollars in stolen investor money. Martha covered her mouth with trembling hands, shaking her head in denial. She desperately whispered that it had to be a mistake, that her son would never commit such terrible crimes. Knowing how hard financial betrayal is to accept, I produced the ultimate proof. Pulling out my digital tablet, I connected my encrypted drive and opened the audio file extracted from Derek's laptop. Handing Martha a pair of headphones, I watched her tear-filled eyes widen in horror as she listened. She heard her own son cruelly mocking my brother's funeral. She heard Natalie cold-bloodedly outlining her master plan to weaponize my deep grief. Worst of all, she clearly heard them discussing using Leo and Mia as emotional bait, intentionally pushing a grieving grandfather to the brink of a breakdown just to secure a fraudulent conservatorship. When the recording finished, Martha collapsed into Richard's arms, weeping uncontrollably against his shoulder. Her heavy, muffled sobs filled the quiet dining room corner. Richard held his wife tightly, his jaw set so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. His deep, unconditional love for his son was instantly replaced by a fiercely protective rage for his innocent grandchildren. Looking up at me, his eyes burned with intense sorrow and absolute clarity. He asked what needed to be done to protect the children from the monsters they had raised. Placing a gentle, firm hand on Richard's shoulder, I told him to go to the kids' bedroom and quietly pack their suitcases with enough clothes and toys for the coming weeks. I instructed them to take Leo and Mia out through the patio door, lead them to the car down the alley, and drive straight to their house without looking back. Drying her tear-stained cheeks, Martha asked with a trembling voice what would happen when Derek and Natalie finally returned from their fake business trip. Looking straight into her frightened eyes, my voice dropped to an unyielding whisper. At 6 o'clock sharp tonight, a massive storm is hitting this house, and I refuse to let my innocent grandchildren sit in the front room and watch their own parents dragged out the front door in steel handcuffs. Richard and Martha nodded solemnly in understanding. They didn't hesitate for another second. Slipping quietly into the guest room where I had stored the kids' overnight bags, they packed their belongings. Martha walked into the living room, masking her deep despair with a gentle grandmotherly smile, telling Leo and Mia they were going on a special surprise adventure to Grandma and Grandpa's house. The kids cheered softly, completely oblivious to the reality hovering above them. Standing by the sliding glass door, I watched them hold their grandparents' hands tightly, walking safely across the backyard lawn. Once they disappeared down the alley, I locked the heavy glass door and drew the thick curtains. The suburban house was finally empty. The silence that settled over the rooms was absolute and heavy. I walked slowly into the formal dining room, the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. Approaching the expensive crystal decanter sitting on Derek's polished wooden bar cart, I picked up 2 heavy glass tumblers. It was finally time to pay tribute to the man who had given me everything. I looked up at the grandfather clock standing in the hallway. The polished brass hands rested at 2 o'clock sharp. In a quiet, peaceful cemetery on the other side of town, my beloved brother Bill was being officially laid to rest in the cold ground. I wasn't standing beside his wooden casket. I hadn't laid a final flower on his resting place. I had been trapped in a digital cage built by my own daughter. Uncorking the crystal decanter, I poured a generous splash of rich amber whiskey into both glasses. Picking them up, I walked slowly into the center of the living room, fully aware that the hidden camera was watching my every move from the bookshelf. I didn't care anymore. Setting one glass down on the mahogany coffee table, I placed it gently on a dark leather coaster. I held the other glass in my rough, calloused right hand. Looking at the empty space directly across from me, I pictured my brother sitting there, his thick wooden cane resting against his knee. The deep, painful grief I had suppressed all morning surged powerfully in my chest. Raising my glass to the empty room, I began to speak aloud, my voice low, steady, and filled with deep gratitude and heartbreak. I'm so sorry I wasn't there beside you today, Bill. I am so sorry I couldn't stand by your open grave and tell the world what a truly honorable, brave man you were. Taking a slow sip of the sharp whiskey, I let the heat steady my racing thoughts. I continued talking to the silent shadows, telling him about the terrifying betrayal I had uncovered, the forged bank documents, the stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the malicious plan to lock me away in a care facility. I assured him that his painful sacrifice back in 1985 had not been in vain. You gave up your health to save my life, Bill. You gave me a second chance to build a family. I spent a lifetime trying to lay a beautiful, solid foundation for my daughter. But the materials I used were severely flawed. The structure I built rotted from the inside out. As a structural engineer, I know you can't just slap a coat of paint over a collapsed foundation. You have to tear it down to the ground, no matter how much it breaks your heart, so you can save the innocent ones standing nearby. I am dismantling it all today, brother. I am protecting the young grandchildren you never got to see grow up. I sat heavily back into the leather couch, resting my elbows on my knees, spending the next 3 hours drinking my whiskey in absolute unbroken silence. I watched the bright golden afternoon light slowly creep across the hard oak floor, casting long, dark shadows that stretched ominously across the empty room. In my mind, I rehearsed every intricate detail of the confrontation to come, hardening my mind and turning my fragile heart into solid steel. When that trap finally closed, I couldn't afford a single shred of weakness or sympathy. I knew Natalie would immediately try to use dramatic tears to manipulate my deep fatherly instincts, and I knew Derek would try to intimidate me with arrogant anger. I had to remain entirely unshakable against their storm. Painful hours passed, and the quiet tension in the house built to an almost unbearable level. Slowly standing from the leather couch, my aging joints aching from deep fatigue, I carried the 2 empty crystal tumblers into the kitchen, washed them thoroughly in the stainless steel sink, and placed them neatly on the drying rack. Walking back to the living room, I sat down again in the fading light, waiting patiently in the approaching darkness. Suddenly, the deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock echoed heavily through the silent hallway. It was 5:45 p.m. A few moments later, the heavy quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the distinct crunch of expensive rubber tires rolling slowly up the gravel driveway. The luxury travelers had finally returned. The heavy front door swung open, shattering the quiet of the dark living room. I sat motionless on the leather couch, shrouded in shadows, hidden from their immediate view. Natalie walked in first, letting out an exaggerated sigh that echoed through the foyer. Dressed in a business suit, she played the role of an exhausted corporate executive to perfection. Derek followed closely behind, loosening his tie and rubbing his neck as if he had spent days at a conference table. They weren't carrying the skis or goggles I knew were packed in their trunk. Instead, they clutched sleek leather briefcases, completing their carefully constructed lie. Watching them perform their deceptive act, a cold detachment replaced the last remaining warmth I felt as a father. They tossed their keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the sharp clink cutting through the quiet air. Derek complained loudly about the bumpy flight back from New York, intentionally projecting his voice so it carried through the house. He claimed the merger negotiations had been brutal, but boasted that they had miraculously saved his firm at the last second. It was a well-rehearsed script designed to make me feel foolish and guilty, ensuring I never questioned their self-importance. Sitting quietly in the dark, my hands resting calmly on my knees, I let them dig their hole deeper. Natalie kicked off her high heels and stepped into the living room, blindly reaching for the wall switch. As her hand brushed the plastic panel, she noticed my silent silhouette in the dim light. She let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward in perfectly fake terror, clutching her chest. She flipped the switch, and harsh overhead light flooded the room, making my tired eyes sting briefly. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just sat there, looking directly at my daughter. The brief surprise on her face quickly melted into calculated concern. This was the exact moment they had been waiting for all weekend. This was the climax of their psychological trap. She deliberately took a step toward me, carefully positioning her body so the hidden camera inside the hollowed-out book on the shelf behind her would capture her facial expressions. I could see the sinister anticipation dancing in her eyes. She was waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for the grieving old man to break under the weight of their cruel abandonment. Crossing her arms tightly over her chest, she narrowed her eyes and lowered her voice, speaking in a tone that blended condescending pity with sharp accusation. "Dad, why on earth are you sitting here in the pitch dark?" She looked around the empty room, her eyes sweeping over the pristine kitchen and the quiet hallway. Stepping closer, she raised her voice slightly to ensure the hidden microphone caught every word. "Have you lost your mind again? What is wrong with you? You're scaring me. Where are my children? Where are Leo and Mia? Did you forget to feed them? Are they hiding in their rooms? Because you started screaming at them again." She delivered those cruel accusations with absolute conviction, painting a picture of a dangerous, senile man who had completely lost touch with reality. Derek stepped up right behind her, crossing his arms and shaking his head in fake disgust. Looking down at me, he said, "Harrison, we trusted you to watch them for one weekend. While we were out saving our family from financial ruin, we trusted you. And we come home to find you sitting in the dark like a complete lunatic. What did you do with our kids?" They stood together, forming a wall of arrogant deception, fully expecting me to leap from the couch in a blind rage. They expected me to scream about my brother's funeral, curse their names, and hand them the high-definition evidence they needed to lock me away in a psychiatric facility come Monday morning. I looked deep into my daughter's eyes, searching one last time for any remaining trace of conscience, any flicker of guilt over the terrible betrayal she was orchestrating against her own father. There was nothing. Her eyes were as cold and empty as a frozen lake. The structural engineer in my mind confirmed that the impending demolition was absolutely necessary. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't jump up from my seat. I didn't give them a single ounce of the explosive anger they so desperately craved. Instead, I slowly leaned back into the plush leather cushions and comfortably crossed one leg over the other. Looking back and forth between them, I met their tense, expectant gazes with a serene, unwavering calm. I let a gentle, warm smile slowly spread across my weathered face, a smile of absolute, terrifying clarity. Speaking in a voice so soft and calm that the hidden microphones must have struggled to pick up the gentle frequency, I said, "You don't need to worry about the children. They are perfectly safe, and they are very far away from here. But you two look absolutely exhausted." Pausing for a heavy second, I watched the arrogant confidence on their faces begin to crack. Maintaining my warm smile, I said, "You two look like you had a very bumpy flight back from Aspen." The heavy silence in the room shattered instantly. The color drained entirely from Derek's arrogant face. His fingers went limp, and the heavy leather briefcase slipped from his grip, slamming violently onto the hard oak floor. The leather briefcase hit the polished floor with a deafening thud. The expensive metal latches popped open, scattering a pile of glossy travel brochures and receipts from a luxury ski resort across the floor. Derek stared at the scattered papers, his jaw slack, his eyes darting wildly between the evidence on the floor and my calm expression. The carefully constructed facade of the exhausted corporate executive evaporated, replaced by the trembling fear of a man realizing he had run straight into a brick wall. Natalie froze completely beside him. Her hand remained on her hip, but her confident posture collapsed entirely. Her voice was a strained whisper as she asked what I was talking about. Trying to force a dismissive laugh, she attempted to rebuild the lie, stammering that I was deeply confused, that they had just flown back from New York, and that my aging brain was playing cruel tricks on me again. I didn't move from the couch. Pointing deliberately at the Aspen receipts scattered across the floor, I told her she should remind her husband to clear his pockets before attempting a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I told her I knew exactly where they had been. I knew about the private charter flight, I knew about the skis in the trunk, and most importantly, I knew the hidden cameras were recording every single second of our conversation. Before Natalie could fabricate another lie, a deep voice echoed from the dark shadows of the adjacent kitchen. The voice smoothly announced that Illinois law requires mutual consent for audio recordings inside a private residence, making her little surveillance network a felony invasion of privacy. Natalie and Derek flinched violently, spinning around to face the kitchen. From the darkness of the hallway, Jonathan Pierce walked slowly into the bright light of the living room. Wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit, he looked every bit the corporate litigator he was. In his right hand, he carried a heavy leather briefcase. His expression held zero warmth or sympathy. Walking with slow, confident strides, he stopped right beside the mahogany coffee table, setting his briefcase down with an authoritative thud. Derek stumbled backward, his eyes wide with panic as he instantly recognized Jonathan. Any commercial real estate agent operating in Chicago knew exactly who Jonathan Pierce was, and they knew that if he was standing in your living room on a Sunday night, your career was over. Jonathan didn't even glance at Derek. He locked his sharp gaze directly onto my daughter. Formally introducing himself as my legal counsel, he calmly informed her that he had spent the entire afternoon reviewing her deeply flawed and highly illegal family court petition. The shock of seeing a powerful attorney in her home broke through Natalie's frozen panic, igniting a wild, desperate rage. Realizing her trap had failed and been completely turned against her, her face turned bright read. She pointed a trembling finger at Jonathan, screaming at him to get out of her house immediately, accusing him of trespassing and threatening to have him disbarred for harassing her family. Jonathan didn't even blink. He stood like a towering monument of legal authority, waiting for her to finish her outburst. When screaming at my attorney failed, she turned her furious, wild eyes back to me. The mask of the caring, devoted daughter vanished entirely, replaced by a vicious, cornered animal. Screaming at the top of her lungs, she demanded to know where her children were, accusing me of kidnapping them. Reaching frantically into her designer purse, she pulled out her phone and held it like a weapon. She shouted that I was a completely unhinged, violent old man who had finally lost his mind. She screamed that she was calling the police right now, threatening to tell the emergency dispatcher that I was holding her children hostage and posing a physical threat to society. Claiming this episode was the undeniable proof the family court judge needed to lock me away for the rest of my life. Frantically tapping her phone screen, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, her chest heaving with aggressive panic, she continued screaming at me in a desperate attempt to create the violent scene her hidden cameras needed. I remained motionless on the leather couch, not raising my voice to match her frantic screams, or attempting to defend myself against her ridiculous accusations. Calmly reaching into the front pocket of my faded jeans, I pulled out my own phone. Looking directly into my daughter's wild, furious eyes, I told her in a voice as cold and hard as structural steel that she didn't need to bother calling the dispatchers. I told her she was right about one thing. The authorities did need to see undeniable proof of what kind of monsters lived in this suburban home. Looking down at my glowing phone screen, I pressed a single preset button, sending a blank text message to a specific number Jonathan had given me earlier that afternoon. Looking back up at Natalie, I gently placed my phone on the coffee table. I told her the police were already here. Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy brass handle of the front door turned with a sharp, mechanical click. The large wooden door was pushed open, slamming against the entryway wall with a loud thud. 2 federal agents in dark trench coats and a uniformed local police officer stepped firmly into the brightly lit foyer. The heavy footsteps of the federal agents echoed clearly on the hardwood floor. Natalie instantly pointed her trembling finger in my direction, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria, ordering the officers to arrest me for kidnapping her children. She expected them to tackle the frail old man sitting on the couch. Instead, the agents completely ignored her dramatic display. They didn't even glance in my direction. They brushed right past her, their expressions icy and strictly professional, locking their eyes directly on her husband. The local police officer casually stepped in front of the heavy front door, blocking the only exit out of the house. The shift in the room was immediate. This was no longer a stage for my daughter's psychological games. It was a federal crime scene. Derek stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the drywall, swallowing hard as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His eyes darted around the room, frantically searching for an escape from a trap he hadn't even realized was set. Jonathan Pierce didn't waste a second. Unzipping his heavy leather briefcase, he pulled out a thick stack of bank documents and slammed them onto the mahogany coffee table, right over the scattered ski receipts. The loud thud made Derek jump. I watched his eyes lock onto the top page, the fraudulent HELOC agreement, complete with my forged signature authorizing a massive loan against my home. Jonathan reached back into his briefcase and produced a second document, sealed inside a protective sleeve. He laid it gently beside the loan paperwork. This was the final key that would seal their fate. Smoothing the paper flat, Jonathan looked straight at Derek and announced that this single document was a legally binding, state-certified revocation of the power of attorney. He pointed deliberately to the official date stamped in bold red ink at the top of the page. November 22nd, exactly 2 years prior. The color completely drained from Derek's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Jonathan crossed his hands in front of him and began outlining the total destruction of their lives in a calm, methodical voice. He explained the law with surgical precision. Manipulating an aging parent out of their financial autonomy was morally bankrupt, but in civil court it would usually be a drawn-out battle. However, Jonathan continued, intentionally presenting a legally dead, completely revoked power of attorney to a federally insured bank to extract $600,000 in equity was an entirely different story. He took a step toward Derek, his presence dominating the room. He pointed out that because the target financial institution was federally insured, the crime fell directly under federal jurisdiction, carrying a mandatory, non-negotiable prison sentence of at least 10 years. Jonathan didn't stop there. He made sure Derek understood that every dark corner of his criminal operation had been brought into the light. He casually brought up the shell company named Apex Holdings, watching Derek's knees visibly buckle at the mention of his secret entity. Jonathan explained that federal agents were fully aware of the massive civil lawsuits pending against his commercial real estate firm. He detailed how the stolen $600,000 had been wired directly into that hidden account in a desperate last-minute attempt to pay off furious private investors he had been defrauding for the past 4 years. Jonathan lowered his voice as he delivered the final blow. He informed Derek that the authorities possessed the complete paper trail, digital wire records, the fake appraisal report, and the hidden camera recordings that proved their malicious plot to silence me. The trap they had spent months building for me had been completely turned around, and Derek was now caught firmly in its steel jaws. The weight of the impending federal prosecution crushed Derek instantly. His breathing grew shallow as he stared at the agents, completely overwhelmed by the reality of spending the next decade in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant, wealthy broker vanished, replaced by a desperate coward willing to do anything to save himself, even if it meant sacrificing his wife. He recoiled, aggressively backing away from Natalie as if she were suddenly contagious. Holding his hands up in the air, he shook his head frantically and pointed his index finger straight at her face, his voice cracking with selfish panic. He screamed that he had nothing to do with the forged signature on those bank documents, shouting that the whole thing was her idea from the start. He claimed she was the one who had signed the paperwork, that it was her father's house, and begged the agents to believe he was just dragged into it. Natalie stood frozen, her eyes wide with total shock, as a sharp, painful cry of pure betrayal echoed off the walls. Her scream subsided into a muffled sob as she stared at her husband, her face twisted in terror as she realized the man she had conspired with was tossing her aside without hesitation. Yet, a cornered predator's survival instinct is remarkable. Instead of collapsing into tears, she spun around and marched straight toward the 2 federal agents. Placing herself firmly between the officers and her trembling husband, she pointed a manicured finger directly at me. Her voice shifted into a frantic plea. She begged the agents to listen, insisting they were making a catastrophic mistake and claiming the entire situation was a tragic misunderstanding caused by a sick, delusional old man. She pleaded with the officers to look at her family court petition, desperately trying to spin her malicious conservatorship scheme into a protective medical shield. She told them I had completely lost my mind, that I suffered from late-stage dementia, and that my attorney was cruelly exploiting my rapidly deteriorating mental state. She swore I was deeply paranoid, claiming I had fabricated the story about a fake business trip and suggesting those complex bank documents were something I must have forged myself during a sudden mental break. I watched my daughter try to weaponize my sanity in front of federal law enforcement. I didn't feel a drop of anger, only a deep, exhausting pity for the hollow shell of a person she had become. Slowly standing up from the leather couch, my movements were calm and steady. The federal agents shifted their attention to me, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, waiting to see how this supposedly volatile old man would react to such aggressive accusations. I didn't shout. I didn't wave my arms in protest. I simply reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out my phone. I calmly explained to the agents that my daughter and her husband had spent a week secretly installing hidden surveillance cameras throughout my private home to record a manufactured breakdown for their emergency conservatorship hearing. Tapping the screen, I opened the audio file I had extracted from Derek's laptop, turned the volume all the way up, and handed the device directly to the lead federal agent. The crystal-clear audio filled the quiet living room, Derek and Natalie discussing their Aspen trip and outlining their calculated plan to dismantle my life. The experienced agent listened in absolute silence as my daughter's voice cruelly mocked my late brother's funeral and proudly explained how she would use her own innocent children as emotional bait to push a grieving grandfather over the edge. As the damning recording played, the last remaining color drained from Natalie's face. Her frantic energy evaporated into thin air, leaving her completely paralyzed by the undeniable echo of her own malicious words. The lead agent slowly lowered my phone, his expression hardening into absolute disgust. Looking straight at Natalie, he told her he had heard more than enough to establish criminal intent. Natalie slowly turned her gaze toward me, her eyes filling with tears of genuine terror. She took a hesitant step forward, softly calling out my name. She called me Dad, her voice cracking with the fragile innocence of a little girl desperately seeking protection. But she wasn't my little girl anymore. I met her gaze, standing tall with no fatherly warmth left in my voice. I told her that when she was a child, I had spent countless hours teaching her the foundational rules of structural engineering, and I reminded her of the most important lesson of all. If a building's foundation is cracked, you can't just slap a coat of paint over the concrete to make it look pretty, I said. You can't ignore deep structural rot and blindly pray the house magically stays standing. You have to tear it down to the dirt and start over. I told her she was the deep structural rot threatening to collapse our entire family, and I was finally tearing it down. The federal agents walked right past her, stepping up to Derek and ordering him to turn around and put his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet house like a final gavel strike. As the local officer began reading Derek his rights, Jonathan Pierce stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. He walked straight up to Natalie, who was shaking uncontrollably as her husband was restrained. Reaching into the breast pocket of his suit, Jonathan pulled out a thick sealed white envelope. He handed it to her, his expression purely professional. He calmly informed her that the envelope contained formal notice of an emergency action taken by Child Protective Services in coordination with the family court. He told her that her children had been legally removed from her custody and safely placed with Richard and Martha. Natalie took the envelope with trembling hands, tearing open the paper seal to scan the official state letterhead. Her breathing turned dangerously shallow as her chest heaved, absorbing the cold words printed on the page. Jonathan stood beside her, his voice relentless. He informed her that Richard and Martha had been granted emergency temporary guardianship of Leo and Mia by a federal judge, citing the toxic and dangerous environment she had intentionally created in her home. He added that the bank's fraud unit had frozen every financial asset attached to her or her husband's name. Joint checking accounts, offshore trusts, college savings plans, absolutely everything had been blocked under a federal sweep pending a full criminal investigation. She was left penniless, instantly stripped of the lavish lifestyle she had sacrificed her own father to maintain. At that exact moment, the lead agent firmly grabbed Derek by the arm and escorted him toward the open front door. Derek didn't look back at his wife once. He dragged his feet into the cool evening air toward the waiting patrol car, his expensive suit looking pathetic against the steel cuffs. The local officer followed, shutting the heavy wooden door behind them with a firm click that echoed through the foyer. The sound seemed to snap the last thread keeping Natalie upright. She looked around the spacious, beautifully decorated living room, suddenly realizing the absolute scale of her isolation. Her husband was gone, headed straight to a federal holding cell. Her children were miles away, safe from her toxic influence. Her bank accounts were frozen, leaving her without a single penny. She had absolutely nothing left. The arrogant, wealthy woman who had stood before me minutes ago shattered into a million jagged pieces. She collapsed. Her knees slammed onto the hardwood floor, her designer suit crumpling around her. Lifting her face, streaming with tears of real terror, she crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out trembling fingers to grab the hem of my faded jeans. Burying her face in her hands, she began to beg. Her voice rose in a broken, painful wail that tore through the quiet house. She pleaded for my forgiveness, her words turning into a stream of desperate apologies, crying that she was so sorry and had made a terrible mistake. Yet even at her absolute lowest, she couldn't take full responsibility for her actions. She frantically began deflecting, pointing a shaking finger toward the front door where Derek had just vanished. She swore it was all Derek's idea, claiming he had pressured her into the conservatorship plot because he was terrified of federal prison. Sobbing, she claimed she was just a helpless, terrified wife trying to protect her family from his financial ruined life, begging me to remember the sweet little girl I had raised. Looking down at my daughter weeping at my feet, a deep, painful wave of fatherly grief squeezed my heart. For a fleeting second, I didn't see the woman who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I saw the little girl in blue overalls who used to follow me around the garage, handing me heavy tools while I repaired the family car. I saw the teenager I had proudly walked down the aisle, the daughter I had spent 40 years trying to protect. My rough, calloused hand twitched instinctively, wanting nothing more than to reach down, stroke her hair, and tell her everything would be okay, just as I had done 1,000 times before. But then the shadows of the empty living room shifted, and the cold reality of the day returned. I remembered sitting alone in that quiet house at 2 o'clock, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of missing my brother's funeral. I pictured Bill's wooden casket being lowered into the cold earth, without me there to offer a proper goodbye. I remembered the unblinking red light of the hidden camera staring down from the smoke detector, waiting for me to lose my mind so she could steal my freedom. The brief spark of fatherly sympathy vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of structural steel. I slowly took a step back, deliberately forcing her trembling hands to slip from the fabric of my jeans. Looking down at her tear-stained face one last time, my expression was entirely bare of emotion. I told her that while Derek may have provided the hidden cameras and fake documents, she was the one who had gladly handed him the hammer to shatter my life. I told her that a true victim doesn't eagerly use her own innocent children as emotional bait to destroy her grieving father. From the moment she decided my freedom and dignity were worth less than a luxury ski trip, she had made her choice. Turning my back on her, I walked slowly toward the front hallway. Jonathan Pierce followed right behind me, his leather briefcase in hand. Reaching out, I turned the cold brass knob of the front door. Behind me, Natalie let out a raw, deafening scream of pure terror, yelling my name over and over, begging me not to leave her alone in the dark and pleading for a second chance she didn't deserve. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the crisp evening air. Walking down the winding concrete driveway, I didn't look back once, leaving my daughter sobbing hysterically on the floor of the empty, camera-filled house, the very prison she had built for me. The evening air filled my lungs as I walked away from the suburban property. Reaching the end of the long block, my reliable truck was parked under the dim glow of a streetlight. Climbing inside, I gripped the worn leather steering wheel and let out a long sigh. My daughter's cries had faded beneath the quiet hum of the engine. The absolute finality of what I had done settled deep into my bones. I drove back to my craftsman home, walked through the front door, and locked it securely behind me. The terrible storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, echoing quiet. Fast forward 1 full month. The wheels of justice usually turn painfully slow. But when you hand prosecutors a complete package with high-definition audio confessions, forged bank documents, and a clear paper trail of stolen funds, those wheels spin with remarkable speed. Jonathan Pierce called almost daily with updates on the legal fallout. The criminal case against my son-in-law was brief. Derek spent 3 days in a cold federal holding cell before his arrogant facade crumbled. Facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy trial that would expose his embezzlement, his defense attorney advised him to surrender. Derek accepted a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence, pleading guilty to multiple felony counts, including federal bank fraud and corporate embezzlement. The judge showed no mercy, sentencing him to 8 years in a federal prison, revoking his real estate license, and ordering millions in restitution to the investors he had defrauded. He traded his custom Italian suits for a standard-issue prison uniform, locked away in a world where his charm meant nothing. As for Natalie, the fallout destroyed every aspect of her reality. Because of her active role in the fraudulent HELOC, federal authorities and the National Bank targeted her relentlessly. To avoid a federal prison sentence alongside her husband, she was forced to cooperate fully with fraud investigators. The bank demanded immediate repayment of the stolen $600,000. Without Derek's illegal income to maintain her lifestyle, she had no choice but to liquidate her assets immediately. She was forced to sell her suburban house at a massive loss just to satisfy bank liens and mounting legal fees. The luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and imported leather furniture were repossessed or sold at public auction. My daughter now lives alone in a tiny, dimly lit, one-bedroom apartment in an industrial suburb, working long hours as a low-level administrative assistant just to cover her monthly rent. Yet the loss of superficial wealth was nothing compared to the destruction of her family. The family court judge reviewed the distressing reports from Child Protective Services, alongside the recordings of her plan to cause me mental anguish while I mourned my brother. The court ruled that Natalie posed a severe emotional danger to her children. Richard and Martha were granted full physical custody of Leo and Mia. Natalie was stripped of her parental rights and reduced to a strictly monitored visitation schedule, currently allowed just 2 hours of supervised visitation every other weekend in a sterile room at a state facility, watched by a court-appointed social worker while trying to explain to her young children why they can no longer live with her. She had built a digital trap to steal my freedom, and in the end, she constructed a permanent prison of isolation for herself. While Natalie's world collapsed into ruin, Jonathan Pierce worked tirelessly to repair the damage done to my own foundation. Armed with the certified power of attorney revocation, Jonathan systematically dismantled the fraudulent bank loan. The National Bank formally acknowledged its loan officers and corrupt notaries' severe violations of protocol. The $600,000 debt was erased from my financial records forever, the heavy lien was formally lifted, and the title to my historic craftsman home was cleared, restoring my property to the safe, unburdened haven it was always meant to be. The malicious family court petition was the next pillar to fall. Jonathan filed a motion for immediate dismissal, submitting the audio evidence of their extortion plot. The presiding judge was furious upon learning the truth, throwing the entire conservatorship case out of court with prejudice, and ensuring Natalie could never attempt such a claim against me again. Jonathan and I didn't stop there. We turned our attention to the shady private doctor who had so willingly falsified my medical evaluations. A doctor selling fake diagnoses to help greedy relatives steal from the elderly was a dangerous threat. Jonathan submitted the doctor's fraudulent paperwork, alongside my actual doctor's pristine medical records, directly to the state medical board. A swift investigation followed. When investigators raided his private clinic, they uncovered a history of similar fraudulent behavior. The doctor permanently lost his medical license in utter disgrace, and now faces criminal charges for medical fraud and conspiracy. The toxic rot that threatened to destroy my life was meticulously identified, removed, and destroyed. I was finally standing on solid ground again, breathing the air of freedom in the quiet comfort of my own home, ready to rebuild my future. A crisp autumn breeze carried the cheerful laughter of children across my freshly mowed backyard lawn. I stood on the wooden deck of my craftsman home, holding 2 mugs of hot black coffee. Walking down the steps, I handed one of the mugs to Richard, who was sitting comfortably on a cedar bench I had built years ago, with his wife Martha right beside him. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you appreciate the quiet rhythm of a peaceful life. We sat in comfortable silence, watching little Leo and Mia chase a bright yellow soccer ball across the wide yard. The children were full of life and unburdened joy, completely shielded from the storm that had upended their young lives just months prior. Looking at Richard and Martha sitting in my garden, I realized my understanding of what family truly means had undergone a profound shift. We were three aging parents who had experienced the ultimate heartbreak of watching our own flesh and blood succumb to absolute greed and moral decay. Yet rather than tearing us apart or leaving us in bitter isolation, that shared tragedy had forged an unbreakable bond between us. We had become an unconventional new family, carefully built from the broken pieces left behind by our children. Our foundation was no longer based on blind, inherited loyalty, but on unwavering honesty and a shared devotion to protecting the innocent lives playing before us. Martha took a slow sip of her hot coffee and smiled brightly as little Mia successfully kicked the ball past her brother, raising her arms in victory. Leaning over, Martha gently patted my arm, her eyes shining with deep, unspoken gratitude for the safe haven we had managed to create together. I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of genuine peace settle into my chest. As a seasoned structural engineer, however, I knew that peace is never something you can simply assume will last forever without proper support. Peace is a delicate structure that must be actively maintained, heavily reinforced, and legally protected against all future storms. Which was precisely why, earlier that same week, I had sat in Jonathan Pierce's polished downtown office for one final, crucial meeting. We weren't there to dismantle a fraudulent bank loan or file a defensive legal injunction. We were there to carefully construct a permanent, impenetrable financial fortress. I had instructed Jonathan to place my entire life, savings, my remaining retirement accounts, and the complete legal deed to my beloved craftsman home directly into a strictly restricted, legally binding, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a powerful legal tool. Once those documents were signed, notarized, and fully executed, their complex terms could not be altered, amended, or canceled by anyone, including myself. It effectively removed my personal, direct ownership of the physical assets, placing them entirely under the protective, independent control of the trust itself, strictly managed by a court-appointed neutral trustee. I built this massive financial shield for a single, unwavering purpose. I wanted to guarantee, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that the legacy I worked 40 years to build with my own hands would pass directly to Leo and Mia once they reached adulthood. Jonathan drafted the complex legal documents with the same meticulous, aggressive precision he used to completely break Derek in federal court. We inserted layers of ironclad provisions and strict exclusion clauses into the heavy contract. I made absolutely sure Natalie's legal full name was explicitly written into the exclusion documents. The legal language we used was unusually cold, scientifically precise, and devastatingly effective. It clearly stipulated that my disowned daughter could never receive a single penny of the wealth I had accumulated. She would never be granted any form of administrative access to the protected accounts, and she was strictly barred from ever challenging the trust in civil court. Even if she miraculously managed to manipulate a sympathetic judge in the distant future, or fabricate another elaborate, deceptive narrative, the rigid legal structure of the irrevocable trust would stand as a massive, solid concrete wall, completely blocking her from any financial gain. I had permanently and purposefully severed the financial safety net she had so arrogantly tried to steal from me. For the rest of her life, she would have to survive entirely on her own exhausted efforts, forever locked out of the gates of wealth she had once tried to force open through cruel deception. As I sat on the wooden bench, watching my grandkids laugh in the warm autumn sunlight, I knew my construction work was finally complete. I had successfully dismantled the messy, decayed pillars of the past. In their place, I had poured a fresh, flawless concrete foundation that would easily support the bright, innocent future of two young children I loved more than life itself. This new family we built wasn't defined by bloodlines. It was defined by truth, respect, and a shared commitment to forever protect one another from the dark storms. I looked down at the rough calluses on my hands, the scars left behind by a long, hard life. But for the very first time in my existence, I finally felt like I had built something that could truly stand the test of time. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, feeling profoundly relieved that they were all safe and sound on their own long, beautiful life journeys. A few days after meeting with Jonathan, I woke up early in the morning before the sun had fully risen above the horizon. The block was completely quiet, shrouded in a thick, cool autumn fog that clung to the damp grass. Slipping into my warmest flannel shirt and a heavy denim jacket, I felt a deep inner need to honor the promise I had made weeks ago in that empty living room. I walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a dark bottle of stout beer. It was Bill's absolute favorite brand, the exact same one we used to drink together on my back porch after long, exhausting weeks of pouring concrete and bending steel. I carefully set the cold bottle on the passenger seat of my truck and drove slowly through the quiet city streets toward the local cemetery. The drive was peaceful, giving me plenty of time to reflect on the unbelievable turmoil of the past month. As the morning sun began to pierce the thick fog, casting long golden rays across the perfectly manicured green lawn and neatly arranged rows of polished granite headstones, I drove through the cemetery's tall iron gates. Parking the truck beside a narrow gravel path, I grabbed the cold beer bottle and walked slowly down the gentle slope toward the newer section of the graveyard. Morning dew soaked the leather of my boots as I navigated the quiet grounds. I finally reached his resting place. The headstone was simple, elegant, and cut flawlessly, exactly the way Bill would have wanted it. I stood there for a long time, reading his name, deeply carved into the smooth gray stone, alongside his dates of birth and passing. The reality of his physical absence hit me with a fresh wave of grief, but it was no longer the paralyzing, hopeless agony that had consumed me on the day of his funeral. It was a quiet, respectful sorrow, a tribute to a life lived to perfection. Slowly kneeling on the damp grass, I felt the cold moisture seep through the knees of my faded jeans. Reaching out, I traced the carved letters of his name with my calloused fingers. I smiled gently, remembering his booming laughter and the rhythmic thud of his heavy wooden cane on my hardwood floors. I removed the metal cap from the glass stout bottle. Holding the top over the fresh earth, I tipped it slowly forward. The dark, rich liquid poured out, soaking deep into the dark soil. Watching the foam settle on the grass, I felt a powerful connection to my brother. Taking a deep breath, letting the crisp morning wind fill my weary lungs, I finally began to speak. I told him everything. My voice was low and steady, drifting across the quiet, misty air of the vast graveyard. I brought you your favorite drink, Bill. I am so sorry I wasn't there on the day you were laid to rest. I know you'd understand, but I still needed to come here and tell you face to face. I need you to know that the little brother you saved all those years ago finally learned how to stand up and protect himself. I sat down on the wet grass, crossing my legs, completely ignoring the cold. I explained the terrifying details of the trap Natalie and Derek had set for me. I told them about the hidden cameras, the forged bank loan, and the awful family court petition designed to lock me away in a dark care facility. I told him that my heart had shattered into a million pieces when I realized my own daughter had orchestrated my absolute destruction. But then I told him about the strength I had found in his memory. I said that while sitting alone in that dark house, waiting for them to spring their trap, I thought of the pure courage he showed in 1985 when he ran toward that falling steel beam. I kept talking, a profound realization washing over me like a warm wave of absolute clarity. I said, "You didn't hesitate, Bill. You saw a catastrophic disaster heading straight for me, and you shielded me with everything you had, shoving me out of harm's way. You broke your own future so I could walk away unharmed. For decades, I thought your sacrifice was just about keeping me alive. I thought it was simply about surviving that terrible accident on the construction site that day. But sitting in that empty living room, surrounded by hidden microphones and treacherous lies, I finally understood the true weight of what you did." Looking directly at the carved letters on the cold granite stone, Warm tears of deep gratitude filled my eyes. "You didn't just save my life in 1985, brother," I said. "You gave me the absolute strength and heavy responsibility to save the rest of my life right now. If I let my daughter destroy me, if I simply surrendered to her cruel manipulation and allowed her to lock me away, I would be throwing away the miraculous second chance you suffered so terribly to give me. I realized that honoring your ultimate sacrifice meant absolutely refusing to let my life be ruined by toxic, greedy people." Tears slid silently down my weathered cheeks, but they were tears filled with deep peace. I told him he had saved me twice. His wonderful memory had saved my soul from being broken. Placing my rough hand on the cold granite headstone, I whispered a final, heartfelt thank you to the silent stone. Turning around, I stepped out into the bright, warm sunlight, completely prepared to truly live the life I was saved for. As I walked out through those 2 iron gates and returned to the normal rhythm of the world, a heavy weight was permanently lifted from my shoulders. A month has passed since that morning at the cemetery, and my life has settled into a beautiful, quiet routine. I work every day in my woodworking shop, teaching my grandson Leo how to properly measure and cut timber, watching my granddaughter Mia paint the birdhouses we build together. Richard and Martha come over every Sunday for dinner. We don't talk about Derek sitting in federal prison, nor do we talk about the cramped apartment where my daughter now lives alone. We talk about the future. We talk about the kids. We laugh, and our laughter fills the spaces that were once suffocated by deception. But I know many of you listening to my story right now might be sitting in the same dark corner I was in just weeks ago. You might be sitting across the dinner table from a family member who uses your love as a weapon. Society imposes a very dangerous lie on us, especially on parents. From the moment we hold our children in our arms, we are told that family is absolutely everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that no matter how horribly relatives treat us, we must forgive them. We are conditioned to believe that setting boundaries with a family member is a selfish act. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Sometimes the blood that is supposed to tie you together is the very water that is slowly drowning you. Abuse should never be tolerated simply because it comes from someone who shares your last name. Disrespect doesn't suddenly become acceptable just because the person destroying you is someone you once taught to walk. I spent 40 years of my life believing my ultimate duty as a father was to provide an unrelenting safety net for my daughter. I thought if I just gave her enough love, loved her enough, and forgave her enough, she would eventually learn to appreciate the foundation I had built for her. I was completely wrong. When you give everything to a person without a moral compass, they don't become grateful. They become entitled. They start viewing your generosity as weakness, and they start looking for ways to wring every last ounce of value out of you before you're gone. My daughter didn't just want my money. She wanted my complete surrender. She wanted to erase my dignity, lock me in a sterile ward, and steal the legacy I fought so hard to build. The hardest thing a parent can ever do is look at their own child and realize they raised a predator. It goes against every single biological instinct we possess. Your heart screams at you to protect them, cover up their mistakes, and take the blame yourself. But you cannot protect someone from the consequences of their own malicious actions without eventually becoming their ultimate victim. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career looking at blueprints. I know that every building, no matter how tall or grand, relies entirely on the strength of its foundation. If the concrete is poured incorrectly, or if the rebar is rusted through, the building will inevitably collapse. You cannot save a condemned structure simply by hanging new curtains or painting the walls a brighter color. You have to be brave enough to swing the wrecking ball. You have to be strong enough to tear it down to the dirt, clear away the toxic debris, and start fresh from the ground up. That is precisely what I did with my own family. I dismantled the toxic structure my daughter had built, and I poured a brand new foundation for my grandkids. It was the most painful decision of my life, but it was also the most necessary. I share my story with you today because I know there are so many good, Hardworking people out there being secretly crushed under the massive weight of their own toxic families. You might be hiding in your bedroom listening to this, or driving in your car, wondering how much longer you can endure the manipulation and constant disrespect. I am here to tell you that you have every right to walk away. You have the right to protect your peace, your finances, and your mental health, even if it means walking away from your own flesh and blood. You owe nothing to anyone who is actively trying to destroy your life. Some people will say I went too far by letting my daughter lose everything. They will say a father should never abandon his child, no matter what terrible crime she committed. But respect is not inherited, it is earned. And abuse should never be tolerated simply because it comes from blood. I pulled away the safety net she used to strangle me and left her to face the real world entirely on her own. Did I do the right thing, or was I too harsh? Please let me know in the comments. I read every single comment, and I truly value your honest opinions. And please tell me which city you're watching from today. Knowing how far these stories reach brings me immense joy. If you found value in my journey, don't forget to subscribe. And if my story gave you the courage to stand up for yourself, please leave a super thanks. Always protect your foundation. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye for now, my dear friends, and remember to stay strong out there in the wide world.